Jesus, I thank you for tonight. Thank you for everyone here. And I lift up every need, every pain, physical or emotional. I ask that you would heal everyone here who needs it. And Lord, I thank you for your beautiful plans to turn all suffering in the creation into glory. You're the perfect pattern, Jesus. And I find it so interesting that you've caused your people, according to the flesh, the Jewish people, to walk in this pattern. So Lord, I ask that you would humble us wherever we're prideful tonight and show us what you want the focus to be. In Jesus' name, amen. So last week, we talked about how Jewish history and church history overlap, especially in those first 400 years. Tonight, we're just going to dive in and focus on Jewish history only. And we're going to cover this in the highlights, 3 periods: the Roman period, which is the origin of Rabbinic Judaism in the Roman diaspora; the medieval period, which is where we see the church start hating the Jews in Jesus' name; and then the modern period, which is about the Jewish question, which leads back to Israel. So why learn Jewish history? Well, God became a Jewish man, not a Roman, not a Greek, not an Englishman or an American or any other Gentile. God chose to become Jewish, and he created the Jewish people for his purposes. The entire Bible story is the beginning of Jewish history. God's plans and promises for the Jewish people have not yet been totally fulfilled. And as a reminder, from the very beginning of the study in Genesis, God created the nation of Israel and the Jewish people who came from Israel to be a light to all darkness in the nations and a bridge back to God from their deception that came from the evil, rebellious spiritual beings or gods. Remember, we talked about that in the beginning? So remember that, not just for this week, but we're going to talk about even more in weeks to come. So now, the recent history of God's people, part 2, Jewish history from Rome to Israel. We're going to cover from the year 70 to the present. So the Roman period, this is Jewish history from 70 to the year 500. So in the year 70, the Romans destroyed both Jerusalem and the Second Temple. We mentioned it last week. The Jewish people were all forced to leave Jerusalem. Following this, there were 2 more Jewish-Roman wars. 1.1 million Jews died in the Jewish-Roman wars. In the aftermath of these wars, 97,000 Jews were taken far away into Europe to serve the Romans as slaves. Most of these slave families ended up in the land called Ashkenaz in Hebrew, which is Germany in English. This is the origin of Ashkenazi Jews, or Jewish people that usually have white skin. They look like Europeans. Other Jews ran away to other places in Europe, Africa, and Asia. Some were able to set up new settlements for Jewish life in nearby cities around the land of Israel. And you've seen this map many times now. This is the last time you'll be seeing it. But this is a picture of the Jewish diaspora, but the first one before the Jewish-Roman wars. So before the Jewish-Roman wars, the Jewish people were already scattered, but they're going to be scattered now even more, as you can see in this map, even more scattering. So some Jews remained back in Palestine, living in areas outside of Jerusalem. Some Jews moved east to join the Jewish communities that still existed in the Middle East since the times of Babylon and Persia. Some Jews had already been in Europe before the Jewish-Roman wars, because by the 400s BCE, so this is before Jesus, before the New Testament, many Jews moved to the Greek islands. In 161 BCE, again before the New Testament, a guy named Jason ben Eleazar and his fellow Maccabees, Jewish supporters, were the first known Jews to arrive in Rome to establish a diplomatic relationship and set up Jewish communities in the European regions of the Roman Republic. So that's where we get synagogues in the Roman Empire, and that was before Jesus even came, but it was preparing the way for what God was going to do. In the aftermath of the Jewish-Roman wars, 97,000 Jews from Palestine were sold as slaves throughout Europe. But this slavery was meant to be temporary, only lasting a generation. All Jewish people were granted Roman citizenship within the empire's territories in the year 212. And so here is where the Jews moved once they had citizenship. So you can see they're moving all around the Roman Empire, wherever they could have the most prosperity. But by this time, there were still Jews in Palestine, but they couldn't be in Jerusalem. As it has always been throughout history, the Jewish people remember Israel as their homeland. Rome and all future governments leading to recent modern times now called this Palestine. I talked about that last week. If they could, Jews stayed in Palestine, living wherever they could, but not in Jerusalem. Palestine still had a major Jewish population until around 400, when the Jewish population of this region declined due to the fact that Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. After 400, some Jews still lived in Palestine, but most of them settled in Tiberias or Galilee for the rest of the Roman period and also afterward. More Jews moved here when the Muslims took over Palestine, but all except 200 were slaughtered by the Christian Crusaders in the year 1100. The 200 Jews who survived the Crusades established the Jewish community known as the Old Yishuv. They have lived in Israel or Palestine continuously since the time of the Bible. So those 200 Jewish people, they've been there since Bible times, and their descendants. So here's some specific names for the different unique Jewish communities, which I mentioned way back when we talked about Ruth. So there's the Ashkenazi Jews. Their skin color is usually white. I just want you to see the diversity of the Jewish people. These are the Jews in the central mainland and eastern areas of continental Europe. Then you have the Sephardic Jews. Their skin color could be olive, could be brown, or it could be white, but it's usually more tan because they're like Spanish, Latin. And the Sephardic are those Jews in Palestine are also called Sephardic, but also in the Near East, North Africa, and Iberia, which later becomes Spain. Then you have the Mizrahi Jews. Their skin color could be olive, brown, or white. These are Jews in the Middle East and deep into Asia. And then Beta Israel, their skin color is usually dark brown or black. This is the Jews mainly from Ethiopia and Central East Africa. So this is Ashkenazi Jews, as you can see, probably used to that. But this is Orthodox, the Orthodox religion. That's why they have the special clothing. And then here's a group of Ashkenazi Jews. And then here's some Sephardic Jews, so of the Spanish and North African and other, where their skin color is more tan based on where they live. And then here you have Mizrahi Jews, or the Middle Eastern Jews. They look more like Middle Eastern. And then here's some Jews from India. There's a special name for them, but I purposely limited it to the most popular names for like the most famous groups, because there's names for Jewish communities like everywhere. But this is the Jews in India I wanted you to see. And this is Jews in China. And this is Jews in Ethiopia, the Beta Israel. And here we have Israeli Jews today. So these are Jews who are born in Israel. These are famous ones. The guy on the left is a famous Israeli actor born in Israel. And then you guys have probably heard of Gal Gadot, Wonder Woman. She's particularly famous. She was born in Israel, and her family's lived there for 6 generations. I think she may have moved to America, though, now, just because of her career, but I'm not 100% sure on that. And all these people are genetically linked back to Israel, the Jewish people from Israel long ago. So before 200, leading rabbis trained new rabbis orally through reading the Bible and reciting detailed oral traditions used to interpret the meaning of each Torah passage. There was a problem, though. After the Jewish-Roman Wars, there was no Jerusalem temple or main center for Judaism to use as a standard for orthodoxy. There was a real risk of the Jewish people forgetting the oral law. The solution to this was the Jewish leadership decided to begin writing down oral traditions as official, authoritative commentaries on the application and meaning of every part of the Torah. So by 200 CE, rabbis had begun adding comments and footnotes to the margins around copies of the Torah. These became known as Midrash. Around 200, Rabbi Judah the Prince wrote the Mishnah, which is a commentary. This is the first big Jewish commentary on the Torah. While reading his work, a committee of rabbis discussed more oral traditions relating to each section. This discussion was written down and called the Gemara. The Gemara was added to the Mishnah. Together, the combined texts of the Mishnah and Gemara became known as the Talmud. By 350 CE, more commentary was added to the Talmud, which completed what's called the Jerusalem Talmud. And by 500, even more commentary was added to the Talmud, completing the Babylonian Talmud. So these are all different, but they're kind of adding to each other, building on each other. So this Roman period for Jewish history after Jesus, around 30 to 500, established the supreme authority of the Jewish rabbis, who descended from the schools of the Pharisees. And there's a key Talmud passage that's very telling on just how deep the authority of the rabbis went. You could think of it kind of in church history is the same as the authority of the Catholic Pope and the Catholic leadership. But it's the story in Bava Metzia, there's the passage there. It's called the Oven of Achanai, or the snake oven. And I'm not going to go through it for the sake of time, but I encourage you to look it up. Very interesting story, but the summary of it is that it establishes 2 extreme ideas for rabbinic authority. Number 1, a majority of rabbis in agreement has authority over one great rabbi who disagrees with him, even if that one great rabbi does miracles and has God's support, like God speaks from heaven and says, listen to him. The group of rabbis that disagrees with him still has more authority above that one rabbi who does miracles and hears from God. Together, rabbis who quote the Torah have more authority than God. I know, very extreme, but it's a crazy story. If if you read it. So in 380, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. After 380, Christians began to take over Palestine, building churches and holy sites to replace pagan temples and other non-Christian establishments. By the 390s, the Christian Roman Emperor gave Jews a protected status as a legal sect within the empire and made it a crime to hurt Jews or vandalize Jewish synagogues. But this was a temporary measure. Ultimately, Jews were rejected and marginalized when Christianity became the only legal religion. From that point forward, Jews throughout all of Europe were usually treated as second-class citizens with varying degrees of persecution for the next 1,500 years. Beginning around the 500s and also afterward, many Jews in various parts of Europe were forced to convert to Catholic Christianity if they wanted to live. This happened in the following locations and around these times. So in Gaul, which is the Roman name of France, 500 to 1000 this happened. Iberia or Spain, between 500 to 1000. The Byzantine Empire, which is just the Eastern Roman Empire, between 500 to 1000. Spain in 1391. 100,000 Jews were forced to convert to save their lives. Spain in 1492, 200,000 Jews were forced to convert to save their lives. Portugal in 1496, where a bunch ran away from Spain to Portugal nearby, hoping they would be safe. But in 1496, just 4 years later, another 100,000 Jews were forced to convert against their will. So they didn't even have a choice at that point. They just said, you're going to be Catholics now. You're going to be Christians now, like it or not. And if they went against it, they were subject to what was called the Inquisition, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then in Russia, former Poland territory, between 1648 to 1762, Jews are being forced to convert to Christianity again. So now we get into the medieval period, Jewish history from 500 to 1500. So in 476 CE, Rome was conquered by a new barbarian king, and Western Europe came under new leadership. So question here, did the Roman Empire fall? And the answer is yes and no. So Daniel's prophecy in the Bible talks about the kingdoms leading up to the end times when Jesus returns. At the very end, we have the Roman Empire united, but then at the very, very end, the calves and the toes, we have what's called Rome divided, and we're still living in that. And it's very interesting if you look at what has happened politically with the Roman Empire in terms of like, where is Rome today? Because there is no Roman Empire today, but you can trace a direct line from Rome to all the powers that exist to this day. And so I'll give you a summary of that. So first, there's the divisions of Rome in terms of geopolitical successors. So actual people that conquered the land of the Romans and just took over that government. And so in a sense, they're kind of like the successors to the Romans. There's been many successors and claimants to the continued Roman Empire, but here are the most significant highlights. I did not include all of them because there's actually a ton of obscure ones. This is just the most significant. So first, there's the Byzantine Empire. Now, the Byzantine Empire was the Roman Empire, the same one. It's just that it split in half between East and West. And the Eastern one still had power, but the capital moved from Rome to Byzantium, hence the name Byzantine Empire. And so the West just declined more and more and fell and was conquered by barbarians. But the East continued as the Byzantine Empire, and it didn't fall until 1453. That's relatively recently. It fell to the Ottomans, a Muslim empire. Then you have the Holy Roman Empire, which some say was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, but it was started by this guy named Charlemagne, who came in and dominated all the other barbarians. He was of German ancestry, and the Pope crowned him the Roman Emperor, the new emperor in the West. So this was a serious political entity that's known as the First Reich, and it fell to the French in 1806. But then when the German Empire came to rise, it was known as the Second Reich, and it dissolved after World War I in 1918. But then the Nazi German Empire was known as the Third Reich, which I'm sure you guys have heard of before at some point, which fell to America in the West and Russia in the East between 1941 to 1945. And America still occupies Germany to this day. The country of Germany now has mandatory United States American occupation until the year 2045, another 22 years from now, which is why soldiers like my friend Luke get stationed in Germany. So the Ottoman Empire fell in World War I to Britain, France, and Italy in 1922, but they lasted a very long time also. They started in 1453, as you can see, and they went until 1918, the end of World War I. Then the Spanish Empire, which didn't lose its final colony until 1975. They were actually named as the legal successor to the Byzantine Empire. When it was falling to the Ottomans, they're like, our last will and testament, Spain shall take over the Roman Empire. Then there's the Russian Empire, which fell between 1917 and 1922 and became the communist USSR. Once again, one of the last Byzantine emperor's daughters married the Russian Tsar. And Tsar is the Russian term for emperor. It comes from Caesar. So once again, trying to continue the Roman Empire. Then the French Empire with Napoleon, which fell in 1870, but they dominated Europe and were claiming successor to the Roman Empire. And they actually conquered the Holy Roman Empire, so legitimate in that sense. The Austrian Empire then fell after World War I in 1918, also conquering territory from the Holy Roman Empire and taking over it. And then, of course, the kingdom, now country of Italy, which was unified in 1946, that's where Rome is. The ancient city of Rome is in Italy now. And they really initiated the Renaissance, which spread throughout Europe. But Renaissance means rebirth of Roman culture. So the whole idea is Rome reborn. So Italy could claim it. But then in a spiritual sense, or maybe inspired, because it's less, these people didn't necessarily conquer, more of a stretch to say, but they definitely inspired by Rome, and they have the eagle and stuff like this. You have the British Empire, which dominated the globe from 1601 to 1997. The ancient people of British islands were mixed Roman citizens, because Rome owned more than half of Britain. The British Empire was established based on values connected with the ancient Roman Republic. It gradually became the British Commonwealth of Nations in the 1900s, and the Commonwealth of Britain still includes these countries today: Canada, Australia, South Africa, Jamaica, New Zealand, the Bahamas, and many others around the globe, originally the source of the 13 colonies that became the United States of America, which America herself dominating the globe since 1944. So as you can see, Rome, in many ways you could say, is still going. Finally, the ultimate spiritual successor to the Roman Empire is the Holy, so-called Roman Catholic Church, organized like the Roman Empire. Some view Emperor Constantine I, who was a Roman emperor who legalized Christianity, as the first pope. Pope means father. Detailed hierarchy and organizational system of regional leaders. The Catholics are very organized, like the Roman Empire. They have these cathedrals, which are main headquarters over each major region, which are called dioceses. And the churches that are underneath the cathedrals are also called abbeys or monasteries. They're smaller buildings, but like I said, they're all under the authority of a local cathedral. It's very organized. We're not really used to that as Protestants, but the Catholics are very organized, like a kingdom, like a business. And so this is the beginning of what's called Christendom, or the church as the kingdom of God on earth. And in this spiritual sense, the Catholic Church is the Roman Empire continued. And the hierarchy of the Catholic Church to this day, from the bottom going up, there's 6 ranks of authority. The deacons, the lowest, then the priests, then the bishops, then archbishops, then cardinals, and then the pope. So the medieval period saw the rise of many new competing kingdoms ruled by foreigners in the territories of the crumbling Roman Empire. After the Western Roman Empire descended into conflicts from the barbarian invaders, the church was co-ruler with basically every new government system in Europe. The church was always combined with the state. In many cases, the Pope even had control over kings. No one could go against the Catholic Church's authority. After the city of Rome was conquered by foreigners, the government administration of Western Europe finally fell apart. Foreign invaders began pouring into Europe from the east. These people were called barbarians, like I said, because they were viewed by the Roman citizens as uncivilized. All barbarians were originally pagans. This is the origin of like the Viking and Norse culture. Scholars call them Germanic tribes, which is where we get the word German from in Germany. Those who conquered lands and those who owned lands, the most wealthy, became kings in this new system of government. The kings rented out their land, called kingdoms now, a hierarchy system of lords. Lords rented their sections of land out to peasants and serfs, and this is what's known as the feudal system. So in the feudal system, you could not own or use land without taking an oath in the name of Jesus. Jews refused to take any such oath, so they developed careers and ways of life that either allowed them to live as continual travelers or for them to have homes in established towns or cities with their own businesses. Some Jews became merchants traveling around Europe and eventually around the medieval world. Other Jews became skilled craftsmen, making clothes, shoes, and other quality products to sell for their personal income. In this time period, Christians were not allowed to lend money to other Christians. However, Jews were allowed to lend money to Christians and help mediate financial transactions between Christians. Really, the powers like the kings used the Jewish people as a way to control the flow of money. To stay in certain areas in Europe, many Jewish people became money lenders. Some successful Jewish people eventually established banks based on this practice. Some Jews were extremely successful in these businesses, but sadly, it also led to the anti-Jewish stereotype of Jews being all about money and being cheap. This is also the basis of some modern-day conspiracy theories. You may have heard some before because they're still pretty popular. I'll talk about them more later. Okay, so some famous rabbis and new commentaries, because we don't have enough commentaries yet. The French rabbi Rashi, from 1040 to 1105 is when he lived. He wrote an extensive commentary on both the Tanakh, that's the entire Bible, Jewish Bible, and the entire Talmud, both of them. Then there's the Spanish-Egyptian rabbi called Maimonides, also called Rambam, lived from 1135 to 1204. He wrote many popular books, most notably the Mishnah Torah, which is not the Mishnah or the Torah, but just a new commentary called the Mishnah Torah, a complete commentary code of the Talmud. Then there's the Spanish and early Israeli rabbi Joseph Caro, 1488 to 1575 was his life. He wrote a commentary on Rambam's Mishnah Torah and other defining commentaries to clarify the Torah and Talmud, because it's still not clear. Polish rabbi Moses Isserles, 1520 to 1572, wrote Mapa, which means tablecloth in Hebrew, because the ones that came before this were called the table, so he wrote the tablecloth to cover it. Another detailed codification of the previous commentaries on Talmud to understand and apply Torah to Jewish life. In addition to these most famous rabbis, other rabbis also wrote commentaries on the previous commentaries. Today, Rabbinic Judaism recognizes 613 laws directly from the Bible's Torah of Moses. However, the Jewish oral law from the Talmud and all these other commentaries adds about 300,000 new laws. Most Jews in medieval times lived within distinct Jewish communities in cities or towns with synagogues and Jewish schools that were called yeshivas. Jewish communities were led by councils of rabbis that were together known as the rabbinate. Many rabbinates were righteous and truly helped people. Sadly, some rabbinates became corrupt and failed to help their Jewish communities. Sometimes conflicts within the Jewish leadership led to new forms of Judaism. Other times, these conflicts led to revivals and reforms within Judaism. In the 700s, the exilarchs, these were the direct male descendants from the Bible's Jewish kings going back to David in the Bible. I mentioned them briefly, you probably don't remember because I talked about a million things, but I talked about kings. But the exilarchs, they literally could all trace back, name, all the way back to David. They still existed, and they lived in Babylon in the 700s. When a certain exilarch died, though, there was a dispute between his two sons. The rabbis chose one of the brothers over the other to become the new exilarch. In response, the brother who was rejected by the rabbis defied the rabbinic decision and allowed his supporters to proclaim him as the rightful exilarch. This Jewish rebel against the rabbis was named Anan. The rabbinic Jewish community rejected Anan and his followers, so they started a new major movement called Karaite Judaism. Now, the Muslim government over Babylon originally intended to kill Anan for rejecting the rabbinic authority, since the rabbinate usually worked together with the Gentile governments. A fellow prisoner who was a Muslim saved Anan's life. After this, Anan moved from Babylon to Palestine with his supporters. They settled in Jerusalem and built the first Karaite Jewish synagogue. And Karaite comes from the Hebrew word meaning to read. Karaite Jews reject the oral law and traditions of the rabbis. Karaites believe Jews should live their lives based only on what is literally in the Bible. Some believe their movement is much more ancient, going back to the time of Jesus or earlier. One of the most famous Karaite Jewish scholars today is a man named Nehemiah Gordon. You can see him pictured there. He's really cool if you're interested in this kind of stuff. Nehemiah Gordon's awesome. So, Rabbinic Judaism left some hungry for a deeper connection with God, because obviously there's a lot of legalism, which tends to be spiritual deadness, right? Within Jewish tradition, ideas of mysticism began to circulate. Mysticism refers to ways to grow closer to God and understand his deep purposes. Within Judaism, this deep study and search for God is called Kabbalah. Some say the teaching and writing of Kabbalah went back to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and Rabbi Akiva in the late 1st century and early hundreds. Sometime within his life, from 1240 to 1305, Spanish Rabbi Moses de Leon published the official book of Kabbalah called the Zohar. The Hebrew word Kabbalah means reception. The Jewish traditions of Kabbalah may have roots in the same sources used by the ancient Christian Gnostics. In Jewish tradition, it is forbidden to study Kabbalah until age 40 because of something that's going to happen later. Many controversial and dangerous ideas come from Kabbalah. Some examples: And I'm not saying any of these are true, but I'm just mentioning them because they're interesting. So Adam had the soul of every single human being, and when he sinned, it was shattered in pieces. So we all share one great soul that's now been broken up. God tried to give his Torah and the special chosen status to every other nation before he gave it to the Jewish people, but every other nation said, no, we don't want it. Go away, God. That's something else that's in there. The idea that Satan is just a metaphor for God's wrath and severity. The idea that all creation literally lives inside of God. And theologically, this is called panentheism. The extreme idea that we, humanity, are the creator. Very extreme idea. And then finally, what's called practical Kabbalah, which deals with how to do exorcisms, which is casting out demons, and world-changing rituals and magic. The popular magic phrase, abracadabra, I'm sure you've heard it before, many think that it's Aramaic or Hebrew in origin. Many believe that it means, I will create as I speak. Inspired by Arian Christianity, that's Christians that don't believe that Jesus is God. They think Jesus was only human. Islam originated through Muhammad's revelations from God in 610. Though it began with many wars, Islam originally had a golden age of prosperity centered in Baghdad. This lasted from 786 to 1258, and it ended due to the Mongol invasions, and the Mongols took over. Our written number system comes from the Arabic numerals. The 1, 2, 3 that we use to this day in math comes from Muslims, the Arabic numerals, which the Muslims learned from the Hindus. Unlike medieval Christianity, Islam originally had a very peaceful and tolerant attitude toward Jews. Jews usually had more rights when living under Muslim governments. And again, this was during medieval times. I'm not talking about today. It's very different today. So an example of this is called the Sephardic Golden Age, which happened in Spain. And this happened when Spain was ruled by Muslims. By the end of medieval times, Muslims became more militaristic and anti-Jewish as a result of the Christian Crusades and the Mongol invasions. So many Christians during this period treated Jews as foreigners and second-class citizens, as I mentioned. They looked down on Jews for refusing to become Christians. Many Christians began talking and writing about Jews as though they were the worst type of people because they were Christ killers. The Christian mindset was that the Jews killed our God. They're cursed forever and we hate them. However, some Christians honored Jews and gave them a special protected status. For example, Charlemagne the Great, who started the Holy Roman Empire, he was very good to Jewish people. And certain popes were actually really good to the Jewish people. So this is a list of the continual persecution of the Jewish people, a summary of it. We have segregation, Jews forced to wear yellow hats and badges and live in ghettos, conspiracy theories, especially blood libels, pogroms, which is random, sudden violence and vandalism against the Jews, expulsions from cities and countries such as England, France, Spain, and others, the Crusades from 1096 to 1291, which is when the Christians were taking Jerusalem and wanted revenge on the Christ killers, the Inquisition from 1478 to 1834. They were questioning Jewish loyalty, even for Jews that converted to Christianity. They were still questioning them just because they were Jewish. So with Jewish segregation, there's this establishment of Jewish ghettos to keep Jews separate from Christians in European communities. It began in Italy, led by one of the popes. Jews were forced to wear yellow hats that look like these pawns in the game of Sorry, right? These yellow hats. You can see them in ancient art, and also here's an example of a guy wearing what they think would have looked like today. And then, of course, the yellow star. It's called Star of David, which the Nazis would eventually make Jewish people wear, but it started before that in these ghettos. And you have blood libels. So recall that the ancient Greek-Egyptian Apion, mentioned briefly last week, believed and taught others that Jews kidnapped Greeks and sacrificed them to their god in the Jerusalem temple. This ignorant idea continued in history, but it became Christianized. Many Christians believed that the Jews would kidnap Christians, especially Christian children, and ritually kill them so that they could use Christian blood to make their matzah for Passover. They weren't very bright in medieval times. Many Christians also believed that Jews would sneak into Catholic churches, steal the holy bread used for communion, which Catholics believe was literally the body of Christ. They believed that in communion, the bread becomes the body of Christ. So they thought that Jews would steal this bread, sneak in, steal it, and beat up the bread so that they could continually just beat up Jesus, like forever and ever. There are too many examples of blood libels for me to list them all, but They were all over Europe and other continents. Here's one of the most famous stories from England in the 1200s. A 9-year-old boy called Little Hugh went missing. They soon found him dead. The English accused the Jews of kidnapping, torturing, and crucifying Hugh. The English accused the Jews of doing this as a blood ritual for their religion. English leaders arrested and tortured a Jew named Copin until he confessed to this heinous crime. So it's not even like he got a chance. They just tortured him until he confessed. The English killed Copin and randomly arrested 90 Jews with the same accusation. One of these Jews who was arrested was a Christian, but because he was Jewish, they arrested him because he was separated from other Jews. So he was double persecuted, basically. And that's going to be a theme. If you become a Christian as a Jew, you're double persecuted. The English condemned and hanged 18 of these Jews, while the other Jews were originally condemned to die by a jury of 48 Englishmen, but they were later released with help from some Christian friars. Not all the Christians were bad. Some of them saw what was happening and tried to help. There were many other cases of blood libel against the Jews. There were also other conspiracy theories against the Jews with no basis in reality. Ultimately, these ideas were rooted in ancient racism and the false idea that all Jews are Christ killers. In response to these deep-rooted beliefs, Christians would occasionally stir up an organized attack on Jewish communities. These attacks against Jewish communities were called pogroms. Pogroms happened suddenly at any time when Christians were moved to attack the Jews. However, many pogroms were initiated around Easter time, when corrupt Christian leaders encouraged their followers to seek revenge on the Jews for killing Jesus. During pogroms, Jewish synagogues, businesses, homes, and property were destroyed. Many Jews were beat up and seriously injured by their Christian attackers. Jewish women were humiliated and raped. Due to the severe violence, many Jews were killed during pogroms. After this medieval period, pogroms would continue to happen, especially in Russia. However, pogroms in modern time clearly became more about pure racism and less about taking revenge against Jews. One of the worst pogroms of all time happened in Kishinev in Russia in 1903, very recently in the scope of history. It started with Russians throwing rocks at Jewish children who just wanted to see the Russian Orthodox Easter celebration. It lasted 3 entire days and was supported by the Russian government and police. 592 Jews were injured and 49 Jews were killed. Jews had been kicked out of various cities and countries since the times of the Bible, if you remember Assyria and Babylon. Kingdoms in medieval Europe used temporary expulsions of the Jewish people and confiscation of their property to rob the Jewish people and enrich the kings and lords of each kingdom. However, they also kicked Jews out because of Christian nationalism and racism. Here's a summary of all the places, maybe not all of them, but significant places Jews got kicked out of. Germany in 1012, and it was temporary, so they were allowed to come back eventually. Germany 1012, France 1254, Italy 1288, England 1290, Switzerland 1392, Austria 1421, Spain 1492, Portugal 1496, and Jews who were kicked out of Portugal at that time ran away to Brazil, which was in South America at that time. They had colonies there. But then the Portuguese came and brought the Inquisition to Brazil, so they ran from Brazil to New York in 1654, which is why New York to this day has a very big Jewish population. And then in Russia, they were kicked out 1791, and then 3 American states in 1862, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Kentucky. And here's a map, which is a summary of the ones I mentioned, but also other places the Jews were kicked out of, and the arrows are showing where the Jewish people went when they were kicked out. So in 1095, the Pope called on Christian soldiers to come together to fight against the Muslims and take back Jerusalem for God's kingdom, the church. The Christian army, called Crusaders because of the crosses they wore, was poorly organized and initially lacked good leadership. In Germany, the Crusaders began seeking out Jewish communities and began slaughtering them without mercy to take revenge on the Christ killers. The Crusaders invaded 16 cities all over Germany to force Jews to convert to Christianity or die. Some Christian bishops tried to protect the Jews from the Crusaders, but the Crusaders frequently broke into the Christian churches and got the Jews anyway. Some converted to Christianity and received forced baptisms to stay alive. By the time the Crusaders finished their time in Germany, they had killed 5,000 Jews, and the world population was not that big back then, so that's like even higher in today's numbers. The Crusaders eventually won their war against the Muslims and took control of Palestine and named it the Kingdom of Jerusalem. After they won the war, the Crusaders locked all the Jews in Jerusalem, because by that time Jews could go back into Jerusalem, so there were a lot of Jews there, but they locked all these Jews in Jerusalem in a synagogue and burned it to the ground. As the Jews inside screamed while burning alive, the Crusaders sang hymns of praise to Christ. From there, the Crusaders killed all the Jews in the city of Haifa, and then they continued killing and deporting all Jews out of Palestine so that it would be purely a Christian kingdom. Before the Crusades, there were 50,000 Jews in Palestine. Afterward, only 200 Jews remained, and they were saved by their location in the mountains of Galilee because the Crusaders couldn't reach them there. So from 50,000 to 200 in their own land. In total, Germany and Palestine, around 54,800 Jews were killed. Then you have the Black Death, known as the bubonic plague. It was one of the worst diseases in human history. Originating in China, the plague was spread by rats all over Europe. Between 1346 to 1352, this plague killed around 200 million people, between 1/3 to half of Europe's entire population. The Catholic Church was unable to stop the plague, no matter how many prayers or rituals they did to beg for God's help. Some blamed the plague on the Jews, with a conspiracy theory that the Jews were secretly going around poisoning wells and water sources. As a result, Christians organized pogroms. Around 12,240 Jews were killed by their Christian neighbors during this time. As a result of the Black Death, Europeans began to lose faith in the Catholic Church. The increase of wealth and culture coming into Europe from the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, combined with the rising interest in secular human reason to produce the Renaissance. And the Renaissance, again, is the rebirth of classical Roman culture and ideas. People began to think for themselves and challenge the Catholic Church's authority. This slowly led to a more secular culture in Europe. So maybe now the Jewish persecution will stop. No, it does not. So during medieval times, Spain was originally ruled by Christians until it was conquered by Muslims in 711. The Christians and Muslims continued fighting, and the Christians eventually took back Spain. In 1391, thousands of Jews were killed in pogroms in Spain. In 1492, the same year Christopher Columbus began exploring for the Spanish Empire, the king and queen of Spain forced all Jewish people to give up their property and leave Spanish territory. Jews were only allowed to stay in Spain if they converted to Catholic Christianity. Many Jews began converting to Catholic Christianity to escape their suffering. Other Jews left Spain and were scattered elsewhere. Around 200 to 300,000 Jews, between half and 3/4 of the Jewish population in Spain, converted to Catholic Christianity. These Jewish converts to Christianity were called conversos. Some Jews didn't truly believe in Jesus, they just converted as a show to appease the Spanish government, and they were called crypto-Jews. For this reason, the Spanish government established the Inquisition, a government administration meant to purify the Catholic Church from false believers. Some crypto-Jews were discovered hiding among the conversos. For this reason, the Spanish began calling all conversos by a new name, Marranos, which means pigs. The Spanish forced Jewish conversos to eat pig meat to prove their loyalty to the Catholic Christian faith. Many Jewish conversos who truly believed in Jesus were imprisoned, tortured, and burned alive during the Inquisition because the Spanish government did not trust that they could stop being Jewish. There was an idea throughout medieval times, and perhaps even beforehand, that life as a Jewish person would be easier if you would simply give up your heritage, forsake your culture, leave your community, and join the Christian church that dominated Europe. Many Jews converted to Catholic Christianity and quickly lost their Jewish background in time. Their ancestors became Gentiles. As persecutions intensified in Spain and everywhere else in Europe, and as Jews began to develop a more secular worldview, many Jews began to believe that the solution to their exclusion and suffering in Europe was to simply become a Christian. Sadly, many of these Jews who gave up their heritage to be accepted in Europe became Jews who hated themselves and other Jews for being Jewish. There's two examples, a guy named Nicholas Donin and Johannes Pfefferkorn. So Nicholas Donin, he was kicked out of his Jewish community for rejecting rabbinic authority and becoming a Karaite Jew. After living 10 years alone as a Karaite Jew, he converted to Catholic Christianity. Using his unique position, he went to Rome to condemn the Talmud before the Pope. As a result, the King of France ordered the most popular Jewish rabbis in France to debate Donin, but the rabbis were not allowed to argue against Jesus, Mary, or any other major Christian doctrine. This was known as the Disputation of Paris. Donin was declared victorious in the Jewish debate, and he was authorized to oversee the forced confiscation and burning of 25,000 copies of the Talmud. Donin suggested that both force and persecution were necessary to make Jewish people convert to Christianity. Then you have Johannes Pfefferkorn a bit later. He was born Joseph, a Jewish man born in Germany. He ended up in poverty, so he committed burglary. He was in prison for his crimes, but then released after a short time in 1504. In 1505, both he and his entire family converted to Catholic Christianity and were baptized. Like Donin, he condemned the Talmud as the ultimate Jewish stumbling block against faith in Jesus. He recommended that Christians should take away the Talmud by force from the Jews and force them to attend weekly church services. He condemned Jews for their money-lending businesses and that they needed to abandon this practice, he said. Despite the fact that Pfefferkorn was a faithful Christian, the brilliant Christian scholar Desiderius Erasmus, who, by the way, is famous because the King James Version used what's called the Greek Textus Receptus, Erasmus to translate the New Testament. To this day, comes from Erasmus. Hated him, so Pfefferkorn, simply because he was Jewish and didn't trust his conversion. Erasmus just hated Jews. We're in the modern period now, from 1500 to 2023 today. First, we have the Protestant Reformation in 1517. Begins with the German Martin Luther, who nailed 95 theses to the door of a Catholic church to protest and bring reform to the church. Christianity becomes extremely divided as Catholics and Protestants go to war with each other, killing each other for who has the right faith. Meanwhile, the new ideas that challenge the church slowly begin to bring changes in the mindset and status of the Jewish people. The Protestants actively seek Jewish people to convert to true Protestant Christianity, to join them against the evil Catholic Church. On the left, you see Martin Luther started the Protestant Reformation, and also another famous reformer was named John Calvin, who you can see on the right. So Lutheranism was extremely tolerant and easy for new converts. Many Jews began to think that they would be fully accepted in Europe, and life would get a whole lot easier for them. They just converted to Christianity. This leads to a crisis of assimilation, many Jews leaving their communities and slowly becoming Gentiles. From around 1800 to 1930, between 250 to 500,000 Jews chose to convert to Christianity with hope that they would be accepted in European society. Martin Luther hated Jews. In his commentary on the book of Romans, so a Bible commentary, specifically in the passage where Paul says that God's gifts and calling on Israel are irrevocable, Martin Luther says the Jews deserve to be hated. God hates them, and so they are hated by the apostles and all who are of God. Luther's hatred of Jews inspired other thinkers also. Agreeing with Luther, the French John Calvin said that Jews should be oppressed unendingly and without measure, and that they die in their misery without the pity of anyone. In future Germany, Nazi leader Adolf Hitler would say that Martin Luther was one of his greatest inspirations. Closer to the end of his life, Luther also wrote an entire book against the Jewish people called On the Jews and Their Lies. In this book, Martin Luther gives suggestions on how Christians should treat Jewish people, burn down Jewish synagogues and schools in the name of Jesus to prove that we, Christians, honor the Lord and His church, completely destroy all Jewish homes and take away all their money, forbid rabbis from teaching with death threats and take away every Talmud, forbid them from doing business and force them to become slaves. Do not let them leave or escape the country, or force them to leave the country. So in the midst of all this horrible persecution Jewish people are facing, the Jews all over the world were beginning to ask questions about their suffering. Many wondered, why is God doing this? They sought meaning and answers. In the midst of this, a major crisis among the Jewish people happened in the mid-1600s. There was a Jewish rabbi from Smyrna who was born and raised on the Greek islands that belonged to the Ottoman Empire at the time. His name was Shabbatai Tzvi. He was influenced by a combination of ideas from Kabbalah, Protestant Christianity, and his personal mental illness. In 1648, he began going around proclaiming that he was the promised Messiah who would save the Jewish people and establish a kingdom in Israel. At first, Shabbatai Tzvi was rejected by his Jewish community in Greece. The local rabbinate branded him a heretic and excommunicated him. But other Jews still believed in him, so he began traveling around the world to different Jewish communities to proclaim himself as the Messiah. He did many signs to prove his messianic identity. He helped the poor and performed live musical concerts, singing psalms and love songs. Married a Torah scroll in full Jewish wedding ceremony. Kind of a weird one, but some people were into it. Married a prostitute who had claimed God told her she would marry the Messiah, and this was accepted by many as the sign of Hosea. He marched to Jerusalem to enter the holy city in triumph with a plan to take over. He was made more bold by support from two Jewish leaders. First, Abraham Yechani, a Jewish preacher who wrote a sort of prophecy that was fulfilled by Tzvi, and Nathan of Gaza, who proclaimed himself to be the second coming of Elijah the prophet, according to Malachi's prophecy, basically making him John the Baptist for Shabbatai Tzvi. In 666, Nathan of Gaza publicly proclaimed that Shabbatai Tzvi was the long-awaited Messiah. Jews from communities around the world began leaving their homes to go support Shabbatai Tzvi as the Messiah. In addition to the Jewish followers, many Christians from England began to believe and proclaim that Shabbatai Tzvi was the second coming of Jesus Christ. This started a Christian cult that joined with a Jewish cult, which became known as Sabbateanism. At that time, the land of Palestine was controlled by the Ottoman Empire that was ruled by a sultan. Shabbatai Tzvi claimed that he would march to the sultan's palace and demand that the sultan surrender his crown and the entire Ottoman Empire to him. Tzvi and his leading supporters rulers claimed that this would end with his ultimate messianic victory without any wars. Zvi marched into the palace and demanded that the Sultan give him the crown and empire. Instead, the Sultan put him and his followers in prison. The Ottoman Sultan told Shabbatai Zvi that he could either convert to Islam or die. In response, Zvi converted to Islam. All his followers also converted to Islam, still believing that Shabbatai Zvi was the Messiah. Shabbatai Zvi was banished to the western Greek coast and died there as a Muslim in 1676. Jews all over the world were devastated. However, many Jews still believed that Shabbatai Zvi was the Messiah, and Sabbateanism became a sect within Judaism for the next century. After Shabbatai Zvi's death, many of his followers began to believe and teach that his soul would be reincarnated soon. In the 1700s, a man named Brahi Russo claimed to be the reincarnation of Zvi. He led the most radical Sabbatean sect, teaching that the Torah and all its ritual laws were now abolished. Sexual hospitality, which was using communal sexual acts and orgies for worship. Like Islam, Christianity had many important truths, he taught, including the Trinity and the fact that God became a human being. When Rousseau died, his son-in-law, Jacob Frank, was praised as the new reincarnation of Shabbatai Zvi. Jacob Frank continued leading his radical Sabbatean sect deeper into controversy. He moved north to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where he led members of a local Jewish community into an incident that created a severe controversy. So Frank and his followers had enticed a local Jewish community to participate in one of their radical Sabbatean rituals. In their ritual, the local rabbi's wife got naked, and they put the crown of a Torah scroll on her head. The others also got naked and danced around the rabbi's wife, singing songs, eating non-kosher food, and wearing crosses around their necks. Other Jews found them doing this and were furious, leading to a fight that had to be broken up by police. As a result of this, the Orthodox Jewish rabbinate was forced to publicly condemn Sabbateanism as a horrible heresy in order to prevent persecution from the Christians in that region. Because by this time, Jewish people wanted to accept as many of their own as possible, even if they were like on the fringe, because they didn't want to lose more Jewish people from the community. Jacob Frank tried to turn the Christian authorities against the Orthodox Jewish rabbis, but it was only temporarily successful. In 1758, Jacob Frank and all his followers officially got baptized and converted to Catholic Christianity. From that point forward, Sabbateanism was no longer a Jewish movement. It became a Gentile cult with divided groups connected to Christianity and Islam. A small minority of Sabbateans still exist today, but they are all Christian and Muslim cults. None of them are connected to Judaism anymore. These events revealed that many Jews did not want to be Jewish anymore. Many Jews wanted to assimilate into Gentile cultures and be accepted. But other Jews sought to maintain their unique culture and heritage, but also to do so in a new way. So the Protestant Reformation inspired Jewish people to challenge old assumptions about their own faith in Orthodox Judaism. Certain figures in the rabbinate were corrupt, leading many Jews to seek God outside the ancient rabbinic tradition. A few new movements in Judaism that grew out of this time include Haredi or Hasidic Judaism, some call it ultra-Orthodox, Reform Judaism, which had this conflict between the original Reform and what became known as Radical Reform Judaism, and Conservative Judaism, which was a reaction against Radical Reform Judaism. Starting with the origin of Haredi Judaism, later called Hasidic Judaism, it began in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which is now Ukraine, in the 1700s. A Jewish man named Israel ben Eliezer began this movement. He was born in severe poverty, and both his parents died when he was only 5 years old. Trained under another rabbi, he quickly became a child prodigy and major influence in the Jewish world of his time. He and his students after him went by the title Rebbe, a Yiddish form of rabbi. He became known as the Baal Shem Tov, which means master of the good name. The Baal Shem Tov went deep in studying the Torah using Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, and he began traveling around different Jewish communities doing miracles. Using his personal connection with God, he healed the sick and cast out demons. His teachings were revolutionary and legendary, and Jews all over the world began following his teachings after he died. This is the origin of Haredi or Hasidic Judaism. The Baal Shem Tov essentially began a revival within Judaism. He and his followers wanted to bring Jewish people back to the heart of their faith, focused on deep personal and intimate connection with God through studying the Torah in the lens of Kabbalah. Some see this movement as a type of charismatic or Pentecostal movement within Judaism. At first, Hasidic Judaism was rejected by the mainstream Orthodox Judaism, but in time, Hasidic Judaism integrated and grew together with Orthodox Judaism. Today, they are sometimes called ultra-Orthodox, a term coined by an American Jewish professor culture, but this is not what they call themselves, and it is considered offensive. Now we have Reform Judaism. Began in the mid-late 1700s with this guy named Moses Mendelssohn. Moses was a German Jew who believed Jews needed to work harder to reform their religion to make it conform with German society. They started reading the Torah and doing Jewish Sabbath services in German or other common languages instead of Hebrew. They initially rejected the ancient idea that Palestine was the Jewish homeland. They said, Germany is our country and our homeland. Many came to America. They said, America is our country and our homeland, not Palestine. They started calling synagogues temples, and that's why many Jews to this day you meet, they call, we're going to temple, came from this. To integrate their holy places of worship with the idea of the long-lost Jerusalem temple. But this led to what's called radical Reform Judaism. So what happened is Reform Judaism sought to convince non-Jewish Germans and non-Jews all over the world that the Jewish people shared the same values that are celebrated in Christianity. The goal was assimilation, or mixing together with Gentiles. However, in a short time, certain groups within Reform Judaism started basically becoming Christian without Christ. Moses Mendelssohn's descendants soon converted to Christianity for full acceptance. When the movement came to America, rabbis started being called reverends, like Christians. Instead of temples, synagogues in America at first were called churches, but they were Jewish services. Jewish, in quotes there, so they're becoming more and more Gentile. Not everyone in the Reform Judaism movement went this far, but those who did began being labeled radical reform. So this led to conservative Judaism. Many Jewish leaders were alarmed by radical Reform Judaism and how it was pushing many Jews to abandon their heritage and become Christians. In response to this crisis of Jewish assimilation into Gentile cultures, a new movement called conservative Judaism was born in 1887. Conservative Judaism brought Reform Judaism back to traditional Jewish teachings and values, but without the strictness or intensity of Orthodox Judaism. I've been to a conservative synagogue before. They're really nice. There's one close by. And the sermon he gave, I went there a couple times, but one of the sermons he gave was raising awareness on the persecution of Christians around the world today, which I thought was very interesting that they would talk about that at a Jewish service. Now we have the Jewish question, special or equal. So while all these new things were happening in the world's religions and politics, each country began to ask the question, what do we do with the Jews? They asked both positively and negatively. Are Jews special? Should they have a special status? Many said yes. Others concluded Jewish people are human beings, just like the rest of us. They are equals in every way. The debates about this issue became known as the Jewish question. Among those who had come to hate Jewish people, this became known as the Jewish problem. Despite still having those who hated them, the Jews were slowly beginning to gain more acceptance and support in the modern world. Growing out of the Renaissance, the Enlightenment movement encouraged all people to think for themselves and use reason. People began to challenge tyrannical government systems. Most notably, and really kicking off these movements, is the American Revolution from 1765 to 1791, which led directly to the French Revolution, which happened in 1789 to 1799. And the French Revolution then inspired revolutions all over the world because countries are realizing, why are we letting the government do that to us? So they start rising up, overthrowing the tyrannical government. As a result of these things, certain people began to fight for equal rights for all human beings, including all the Jewish people. So this led to Jewish emancipation, which means Jewish people becoming citizens. So before this time, Jews were not considered fully legal citizens in the countries where they lived. In 1791, as part of the French Revolution, the Jews in France were emancipated, meaning set free, made citizens, equal rights. This began the emancipation of Jews around the world. In Greece in 1830, the Netherlands or the Dutch in 1834, Spain in 1837, Ottoman Empire in 1839, Britain or the United Kingdom in 1858, Italy in 1861, Mexico in 1865, Canada in 1867, Germany in 1871, and finally at the very end, Russia in 1917. After more than a century of Jews there were facing the worst treatment ever in Russia, and then Romania in 1923, 100 years ago. Romania was the last country to give the Jews citizenship and equal rights. America was an exception because Jews in America gained citizenship before the Jews of every other country in 1789. So now we're going to talk about the Jewish history in two countries, Russia and America, starting with Russia because it's particularly relevant to the very modern situation. So between 1648 and 1764, many Jews found a life of security in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This changed when the Russian Empire invaded and conquered the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In 1791, the Russian Empire established the Pale of Settlement, the far western border of the Russian Empire where Jews of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth were now forced to live. Except in rare special cases, Jews were forbidden from living anywhere in the massive Russian Empire except in the Pale of Settlement. Before the Holocaust, Jews faced the most extreme and medieval forms of persecution in the Russian Empire. The Russians usually hated Jews and treated them like a disgusting disease within the pure Russian population. Even when Jews converted to Christianity, they still faced the same persecution and discrimination as Jews who never converted. The Russians kept track of Jewish ancestry and discriminated against anyone who had even one single Jewish grandparent. At various times between 1791 and 1917, Jews in Russia were forbidden from traveling, forced to serve in the military without possibility of promotion, forced to give their children, ages as young as 5 to 18, to the government for military service, subjected to abuse, injury, and murder in increasingly violent pogroms. Thousands of Russian Jews died in pogroms, and Russian pogroms were usually sponsored by the Russian Tsar, the Emperor, and the Russian Orthodox Church. In some pogroms, little Jewish girls were raped to death while parents were forced to watch. Really sick stuff. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, things were getting even worse. The worst pogroms ever began taking place, including the infamous 3-day pogrom at Kishinev. Meanwhile, Russian Jewish war heroes who received medals for their service in the Russian government were treated with dishonor and humiliated when the military came up with new laws against Jewish soldiers and veterans. New laws prevented Jews from getting educations, having certain businesses, or gaining leadership positions in the Russian Empire's government. Since the Russian Empire's government was a tyrant against all Russians in general, the Tsar was forced to allow limited voting rights and a new constitution giving some citizens limited rights. But it was mostly a show. Certain Jews who had converted to Christianity were promoted at this time in the new Russian government, but they were assassinated. Some in the government tried to punish the evil agents of the Tsar who assassinated these Christians with Jewish heritage, but the corrupt government was victorious and the assassins got away with it. When a Russian gang stabbed a 13-year-old boy to death, the Tsar and his evil government tried to blame the boy's death on a non-religious Jewish man who owned a successful factory business. They accused the Jewish man named Belis of leading a blood libel ritual sacrifice to make matzah on Passover, even though Belis was working on the Sabbath when the boy died, and he wasn't religious at all. The Russians held a public court case trying to force Belis to be condemned for the crimes of the Russian gang. Despite their best efforts, the defense, who supported Belis, won the case. So in that sense, it was kind of a happy ending, barely. After this, Belis and his family quickly left Russia to live in Palestine and then America. After experiencing all these things, many Jews in Russia had enough. Between 1881 to 1914, nearly 2 million Jews left Russia to become citizens in other countries where they could have better lives. This was the largest Jewish immigration in history up to that time. Most of these Jews moved to the United States of America, but others settled in Palestine, Britain, Argentina, Canada, Australia, South Africa, and France. During World War I, Germany invaded the Russian Pale of Settlement. Upon becoming part of the German Empire, nearly half of all formerly Russian Jews immediately gained German citizenship and equal rights. Their lives were better under German military occupation than in their special status in Russia. In response, the Russian government finally abolished the laws that forced Jews to live in the Pale of Settlement. After this, Jews were free to move wherever they wanted in Russia. The extreme corruption of the Russian Tsar and his government infuriated the Russian people. Russia's humiliating defeats in their war with Japan and in World War I were the last straw. In 1917, the Russian people began a revolution against their corrupt government. They assassinated the Tsar and established a new communist government under Vladimir Lenin. After all these things, the Jews in Russia were finally emancipated. Sadly, Jews in communist Russia, the USSR, were still persecuted by the tyrannical communist regime, but for different reasons. When the State of Israel was eventually established, around another 200,000 Jews escaped from Russia and became citizens of Israel. Another 100,000 Russian Jews during that time escaped to America. Due to Russia's continual problem with tyrannical government leadership, Jews have continued leaving Russia to this day. So now, Jewish history in America. So a small community of Jews came to the 13 colonies in America. when they were under the authority of the British government. During the American Revolutionary War, the Jews in the 13 colonies fought with all other Americans for independence from Britain. The British hired a skilled army of German Jews to fight against the Americans for the British. When the Americans told these German Jews that they would gain citizenship, freedom, and full equal rights in America if they switched sides, they turned against the British and helped the Americans win the war and became Jewish citizens of America. The Jewish people were generally accepted and treated as equals in America, especially compared to everywhere else. The former Dutch city of New Amsterdam, which eventually became New York, became the most popular destination for Jewish communities and immigrants to America. In rare cases, certain wealthy Jews living in the South owned African slaves. American Jews fought on both sides of the Civil War, the Union and the Confederacy. 10,000 Jews fought against each other in the American Civil War. 3,000 Jews fought for the Confederacy, so pro-slavery, and 7,000 Jews fought for the Union against slavery. In an angry reaction against some Jewish smugglers, Union General Ulysses S. Grant forced all Jewish people to leave the states of Tennessee, Mississippi, and Kentucky in 1862. Supporting Jewish Americans, President Abraham Lincoln and his Republican government sharply rebuked Grant for doing this, and American Jews were quickly allowed back into these three states. When Grant ran for president later, he publicly apologized to all American Jews for what he had done to their community during the Civil War. When Grant became president, he was the most pro-Jewish president in American history. Grant established policies that protected American Jewish citizens from other Americans who hated Jewish people. He also helped bring more American Jews into positions of government authority than anyone else had ever done before him. In 1877, Grant passed a federal law that forced every state to allow Jews to run for positions in government. Before this, certain states did not allow Jewish people to run for public office. So, American Jews in California. When California became a state in 1850, many American Jews moved west for a better life here. About 10% of the original inhabitants of San Francisco were Jews. By surface area, this was the largest Jewish population in America at that time. There in San Francisco, a Jewish man with roots going back to the Israelite tribe of Levi founded the Levi's Jean Company in 1853. In 1948, the local government of the famous city of Beverly Hills, which was pretty exclusive, finally allowed Jewish people to live there. Many Jews moved there. So people of Beverly Hills were originally pretty racist. During the persecution of Jewish people in Iran in the late 1900s, thousands of Jewish refugees moved to America and settled in California, most of them settling in Beverly Hills. By the year 2000, Jewish people made up over 61% of all people in Beverly Hills. As the Jewish people faced persecution in other countries, Jews from all over the world began immigrating to America for a better life. The top three countries that Jews left to come to America were Brazil. I talked about the Jews fleeing persecution from the Portuguese Inquisition in the 1600s. Germany in the 1800s. A ton of Jews came from Germany in the 1800s. And then Russia in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. The most came from Russia. Most Jewish immigrants to America would come from Russia when the Russians began to increase Jewish persecution. In the 1930s, when the Nazis began to rise and Jewish life in Germany became increasingly dangerous, thousands of Jews wanted to move to America for safety. Sadly, celebrated Democrat President FDR and his government turned many Jewish refugees away because they feared Nazi spies were using them. As a result, even more Jews would die in the Holocaust. So despite the progress and scientific advancement of the modern world, many people around the globe still hated Jewish people. Originally, it was assumed that people hated Jews for religious reasons. In the modern age, it became clear that those who hated Jews hated them simply because of their unique race and culture, regardless of each Jew's personal religion, since many Jews by this time had become Christians. This phenomenon was originally called Jew hate, but then it was softened by academics to make it sound less extreme to anti-Semitism, which really, not a really good name because it means anti-Shem in the Bible, and a third of the whole world comes from Shem, so the Jewish people are much more narrow category than that. Jew hate is really more accurate. So inspired by Jew hate in the history and teachings of the church, even some Jews in the modern era advocated hatred against their own people. In the 1800s, a Jewish man named Jacob Rothman was born as the son of a rabbi in the Russian Empire. Rothman was orphaned at a young age, but the Jewish rabbinate that was in charge of caring for him was corrupt. The Jewish leadership in charge of Rothman's community abused him and forced him to work hard to survive his childhood. When he was old enough, Rothman converted to Lutheranism to escape the terrible conditions he faced in his Jewish community of origin.
The villain backstory?
Yeah, it is. It really is. So to gain more acceptance in the Russian Empire, Brahman converted from Lutheranism to Russian Orthodox Christianity. As a Russian Orthodox Christian, Brahman wrote and published works based on his research and experiences in the Jewish community of his terrible childhood. In Brahman's published literature, he claimed that the Jewish leadership and their communities were secretly conspiring to control events in world history and slowly take over the world. Inspired in part by Jacob Brahman's Jewish conspiracy theories, the Russian Empire's secret police, led by a man named Pavel Khrushchev, wrote a new book called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This book describes in detail a conspiracy theory that the Jews are secretly working together in different places in every country to take over the world and force all other nations into poverty, slavery, and death. This book is based on lies, and it has no legitimacy. Nevertheless, many Russians and many people from many other nations began believing the message of this text. Hitler's ideas about Jews were largely inspired by this book. Even today, many people believe different versions of this Jewish conspiracy theory. Most recently, Kanye West publicly announced that he believed Jews took over the media and were conspiring against the free world. I've even had friends that lean toward believing this conspiracy theory. I won't say who they were, but they've had some slightly alarming conversations with me about it. Just shows a lot of ignorance. Of course, there are evil Jewish people in this world, just like there are evil people in this world from every nation. Examples, this guy named George Soros. I don't know if you've heard of him or not, but he's a Jewish man who's a philanthropist and stuff. But if you look at his background, he's kind of a jacked up guy. How he started building his wealth, first of all, he's used his wealth to manipulate finances in certain countries and made banks overturn and like stuff like that. But how he started building his wealth was, so he was a Jewish man during the Nazi time. And when the Nazis came in, he was able to convince them to basically let him help them take the property and the wealth away from his own Jewish community. And that's how he started like building his wealth. And there's this interview that he did one time where he calls that the happiest time in his life. It's just a really sick thing to say. So, but this guy is by heritage Jewish. I think he's Hungarian. But despite these types of things, just beware all the Jew-hating conspiracy theories that are still out there today. In the midst of all this hatred against Jewish people in the 1800s and early 1900s, certain Jews were genuinely becoming convinced that Jesus was the Messiah. They sought to use their knowledge and background to help Jewish people by spreading awareness of Jewish culture and history. In the 1800s, a Jewish man in Vienna named Alfred Edersheim converted to Christianity in the Protestant denomination called the Free Church of Scotland. Edersheim was a foundational contributor to the subject of the Jewish roots of Christianity in modern scholarship. Edersheim used his faith and understanding of Judaism from his family background to help Christians around the world realize that Christianity began as a movement in the Jewish religion. Between the 1800s and early 1900s, another Jewish man named Daniel Schwolson was born in the Russian Empire. He studied to become a rabbi and became one of the most brilliant Jewish scholars of his time. By 1855, Schwolson was convinced that Jesus was the Messiah, and he became a Christian. His research helped modern Christians understand the historical nuances and unique Jewish backgrounds of the Sadducees and Pharisees in the New Testament. I was explaining that to you guys before, but if it wasn't for this guy, we might not know some of these things. Schwolson also spent much of his life arguing against the unfounded, stupid conspiracy theories against the Jewish people that led to Jews being hated in Russia and other countries around the world. So the reality of Jew hate was exposed to the world through these events. I'm going to summarize them. So the Damascus Affair in 1840. It was basically a modern blood libel that led to a massacre of Jewish people in Damascus, including the molestation and raping to death of like Jewish little girls and like really sick stuff. The treatment of Jews in Romania between 1848 and 1885, they were second-class citizens. Like I said, Romania was the last country that gave Jews rights. The May Laws, horrific pogroms and massacres in Russia between 1881 and 1917. And then the Dreyfus Affair most hurt the Jewish people in the world. The Dreyfus Affair, which happened in France in 1894 to 1906. What happened is that there was in the French government a very decorated Jewish veteran, French Jewish veteran. And there was a higher up officer in the French army that accused this Jewish veteran of being a spy against the French working for the Germans. Well, what ended up happening is that he was convicted, accused on false evidence and all this stuff. They humiliated him publicly. They ripped his like uniform off and like all this stuff they did to him. It was a controversy around the world. But then it came out later that the ones that accused him were the real spies. So the French soldiers that accused this guy, and they were scapegoating him. So you have this hypocritical scapegoating, Gentile hatred, because people were saying kill the Jew, or they were saying something the Jew. Gentile hatred was exposed, and completely unjustified Jewish humiliation. In France, which was the place where in Europe the Jews first gained citizenship, now they're being persecuted by their own French government and people. Sadly, many people denied that the Jews were hated any more than certain other foreign groups of people. They downplayed the reality of it. But the Jews who experienced this hatred realized they needed a solution to save themselves from the hostile world around them. So many Jewish people realized that they needed their own nation and homeland if they ever wanted to be truly safe and respected by the world. These Jews and those who supported them became known as Zionists. Led by two influential Jewish men named Ahad Ha'am and Theodor Herzl, a group of Jewish leaders from around the world met in Basel, Switzerland in 1897 to discuss plans for the establishment of an official permanent homeland, nation, and state for the Jewish people. Meanwhile, another Jewish man named Eliezer ben Yehuda began working hard to revive and modernize Hebrew as the spoken language of the Jewish people, because by this time Hebrew was an outdated religious language similar to Latin in the Catholic Church. So sadly, the Zionists faced opposition from the other world powers, primarily from the Ottoman Empire and the British Empire. Even many Jewish people were against Zionism for religious or political reasons. Regardless, many Jews began immigrating from different parts of the world into Palestine. Up until the end of World War I, Palestine was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. The dominant population were Arabs that had lived there for centuries by that time, and they are also known as the Palestinians, lived in Palestine. At the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire was disbanded and all its territory was divided up between the greatest European powers. The British Empire took control of Palestine. In 1917, the British issued a public statement known as the Balfour Declaration that promised the Jewish people that the British would help them establish a national Jewish homeland in Palestine. The Palestinian Arabs were furious and did not support this. They did not want to share any of their territory with the Jews. Giving in to pressure from the Palestinian Arabs, the British gave up on trying to help the Jews establish a national homeland in Palestine. Meanwhile, the land of Palestine descended into chaos as Jews and Arabs began developing increasing hostility toward each other. The British soldiers were caught in the middle of the conflict, but they tried to keep peace in the land, often showing favor toward the Arabs. The British faced terrorist attacks from both sides of the conflict, and they would soon face another war that would force the British Empire into further decline. In 1914, a complicated network of alliances between many different European countries exploded into the biggest war the world had ever seen. Originally, this was called the Great War, but in a short time it was renamed World War I. World War I was the most deadly and meaningless war in human history up to that time. Millions died and no one won the war. By 1918, the people of Germany were furious with their government, which was an empire at that time, for leading them into this bloody, endless, and pointless war. The German people had a revolution and overthrew the emperor, establishing a new government system called a republic, which basically means they had free elections and rule by the voters. So the new German Republic officially surrendered on November 11th, 1918, which established Veterans Day. In truth, World War I was everyone's fault. All the countries involved were greedy, prideful, and ambitious for their nations and empires. But sadly, every other country blamed Germany for the entire war. The other countries forced Germany to pay the entire cost of the war in extremely expensive reparations totaling $500 billion. This crushing war debt to the other nations forced the German people into severe poverty, like people were starving to death. Meanwhile, the new German Republic leaders were weak, corrupt, and didn't do much to help the people. As a result of these things, the German people were furious. One of these furious Germans was a World War I veteran named Adolf Hitler. Hitler joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party, called Nazis, and became its leader in 1921. Using the Jewish conspiracy theories from the Russians in his famous book called Mein Kampf, meaning My Struggle, Hitler and the Nazi Party blamed the Jews for all of Germany's suffering and humiliation that came from the end of World War I. Due to the Germans' suffering and rage, Hitler was able to establish the Nazi Party as the leaders of the German government in the early 1930s. When the Nazis came to power, they quickly began passing laws to take away all the rights and citizenship of all Jews and people with any Jewish ancestry in Germany. Between 1933 and 1939, German Jews lost all their rights, had all their property taken away from them, and were forced to live in horrible conditions in ghettos that were basically like prisons. Eventually, the Germans began moving them to concentration camps for slave labor. Many Jews tried to escape Germany during this time, but many did not succeed due to restrictive immigration policies in other countries. In 1939, 1939, Hitler led Nazi Germany to declare war on all of Europe, beginning World War II. The Nazis quickly took over more than half the continent, including the countries of France, Italy, Norway, Finland, Greece, and many other smaller countries in Eastern Europe. As the Nazi Empire expanded, all the Jews in these new territories lost all their rights and became Nazi prisoners, forced to live in severe poverty in ghettos. From the ghettos, most were taken to concentration camps to be worked to death or executed. As World War II developed, Hitler and his government became more and more obsessed with what they called the Jewish problem. The Nazis began making idiotic decisions that cost them precious time and money, and they blamed all their losses on the Jews. Some people think the Nazis actually might have won the war if they didn't devote so much of their resources to this obsession, this ridiculous obsession against the Jews. In 1941, Hitler's Nazi government came up with a plan called the Final Solution. Seeing Jews as a disgusting virus hurting the pure German race, they began diverting a ton of their resources to gather up all Jews in Nazi Germany's territory to kill them in death camps. Between 1941 and 1945, 6.6 million Jews were systematically slaughtered by the Nazis in highly organized concentration camps. 60% of all Jews in Europe, more than half, and 35% of all Jews on earth were killed. This became known as the Holocaust, meaning burning them all. In Hebrew, it is called the Shoah, meaning desolation or wasted, and it's derived from an ancient Hebrew word in the Bible that's found in these passages here, beginning in Job, especially in Job and the Psalms. To this day, the global Jewish population has not recovered to what it was before the Holocaust. So in response to this absolute horror, the nations who defeated Germany punished Nazi leaders and the country of Germany severely. Germany's war debt, or reparations, increased, and they had to keep paying off this debt until 1995. Both America and Russia occupied Germany, and the Germans were forced to agree to be occupied by American soldiers for 100 years. And this continues to this day. It will end in 2045. Led by American presidents FDR and Harry S. Truman, 51 countries all around the world joined a new group called the United Nations. The United Nations committed to keep international peace and protect human rights in every country across the globe so that the horrors of World Wars I and II would never happen again. The United Nations, led by America, worked to help the Jewish people establish a safe homeland for themselves so that nothing like the Holocaust would ever happen to them again. After the end of World War II, the British Empire agreed to give up their control of Palestine to the United Nations. The United Nations developed a plan to divide Palestine into different sections based on the dominant population who lived in each section. In the United Nations partition plan, the areas of Palestine dominated by the Arab population would remain the Arab homeland. But the areas dominated by the Jewish population would become the new Jewish homeland, the State of Israel. The Jews supported this plan, but the Arabs, surprise, surprise, rejected it. British troops officially left Palestine on May 15th, 1948, which is, we're coming up a week from today on 75 years ago. The same day, Jewish people in Palestine declared their independence and raised the flag for the new state of Israel. As the Jews in Israel declared their independence and celebrated their new official homeland, 5 different Arab countries came together against the Jews to help the Arabs in Palestine destroy Israel. So this began the Israeli War of Independence, the first of many wars that would force the Jewish people in Israel to fight for their freedom in their country. Despite all the odds being against them, the Israelis won this war. Including this war, the Jews in Israel from this point forward, called Israelis, would be forced to fight 14 wars between 1948 and 2023. In these wars, Israel ultimately overcame all their enemies in the following countries: Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, Russia, and many more Arab terrorist groups supported by Iran and other anti-Israel countries. No one in the United Nations completely supported Israel in their war of independence or in their other wars against all those nations who sought to destroy them. Though America does support Israel sometimes, many Americans are against Israel and see Israel as the source of conflict in the Middle East. Israel's victories in all their wars were often miraculous. Just 2 examples. An entire Egyptian unit of tanks retreated when they somehow saw hundreds of Israeli tanks coming toward them, when in reality there were only 2 Israeli tanks. And then another time, a massive Syrian army was prevented from marching into Israel for 3 days due to a mysterious paralysis. When trying to explain what happened, an atheist Israeli general said he saw a giant hand from the sky come down and press against the Syrians. Despite Israel's miraculous existence, members of the United Nations have condemned Israel 45 times, about the same amount of times they have condemned the rest of the countries in the world combined. After the State of Israel was officially established in 1948, Jews all over the world began moving to Israel to establish their permanent homes there. The Hebrew word for this phenomena of Jews around the world moving to their ancient homeland in Israel is called aliyah, which means to go up. In the last 70 years, all the Jewish communities that had lived around the Middle East since the times of ancient Babylon and Persia that we talked about suddenly faced new persecution with the rise in Islamic dictatorships and terrorism. These Jews, who had been living in exile and scattered across the Middle East since before the time of the New Testament, finally returned to Israel. Jews and Christians around the world see these events as the end of the Babylonian and Roman Jewish diasporas, and many Christians see these things as a sign of the end times. Israel has the largest Jewish population today, followed by America. Despite all oppositions, Israel remains a strong, successful country. Native-born Jews in Israel are called Sabarim or Sabras. Israel leads the world in agricultural produce and water management. Jewish people all over the world are still welcome to make aliyah by moving to Israel and finding security there. But the Jewish people scattered throughout America and around the other countries of the world outside Israel are called the Jewish diaspora to this day. Diaspora means scattering. As with every ethnic population, there are many different types of Jewish people, and they don't all share the same culture or worldview. Many Jews today are secular and atheist, so they do not want to strongly identify with Jewish history or any idea related to the Bible's teaching that the Jews are God's chosen people. However, other secular Jews celebrate their heritage and see the value in it. Many people still stand against Israel and hate the Jewish people, believing in Jewish conspiracy theories and using the term Jew as an insult. As an example, here's a comment from my YouTube channel in 2019. "Thought you're a Jew, so I hated you." All caps, hated you. One person liked this comment. So due to all the persecutions against the Jewish people throughout history, many Jews worked hard to abandon their heritage, marry Gentiles, and become accepted as part of the larger Gentile world. The Jews who did this assimilated or mixed into the world of the other nations and lost their unique heritage. It is estimated that many people who have any European ancestry today have a Jewish ancestry that became lost during ancient and medieval history. Many people today have a small percentage of recent Jewish ancestry that they don't know about until they take a DNA test. So I've probably mentioned to you guys before, they told me I had 1% Jewish DNA, so I was looking for my Jewish ancestors, but then they're always updating it. And when you have a really small percentage, they don't know for sure. Like my Native American has been confirmed, small 1%, but honestly 1%, you can't claim that you're a certain ethnicity if you have 1% anyway. But I just thought it was interesting. Now they're saying it's Aegean Islands, which means Greek. But the idea is that I could have a lost Jewish ancestry. You guys could too, and you wouldn't know about it. I was researching in my family because I really wanted to know if I had a lost Jewish ancestry. And so here are all the last names in my family ancestry that could have been Jewish. Because what happened when people got last names, it happened within the last 500 to 700 years. There were some last names that were purely Jewish, like Golden, my fiance's last name, for example. And Cohen is one of the most famous Jewish last names. But then there are other last names, like Weiss, it's a very famous last name, but they're really originally Gentile last names. The Gentile governments forced the Jewish people to take last names, even if they were Gentile last names. So these are last names that are all Gentile last names, but they're also pretty common, some of them more than others, Jewish last names. So much so that they're identified as both German and Jewish or Spanish and Jewish. The orange is Spanish ones, the green is German ones. I'm not Jewish. Even if I had a lost ancestor, it's only so small, it's gone. They've lost their heritage, but just to the point of what we've been talking about, how it relates to me on a personal level. So today, Jesus is revealing himself to the Jewish people against Gentile racism, and that's what we're closing with. So in the 1800s, a Jewish man named Joseph Rabinowitz was born in the Russian Empire to a family descended from many great rabbis. When he grew up, Joseph himself became a prominent Jewish rabbi, serving in the movement of Hasidic Judaism in Kishinev. As he continued seeking the God of his fathers, he began interacting with the ideas of Reform Judaism and other new expressions of the Jewish faith that would bring life into their ancient religion. The persecution of the Jewish people in Russia was getting much worse, as we talked about. In 1882, when Rabbi Joseph saw that he and his people were in danger in Russia, Rabbi Joseph traveled to Palestine with plans to set up a colony for Jewish immigrants from Russia to Palestine, which would be the future state of Israel. While he was there, Rabbi Joseph visited the Mount of Olives near Jerusalem, just to visit all the special sites. There on the Mount of Olives, in 1882, the resurrected Jesus appeared to Joseph and revealed to Joseph that he is the Messiah, Jesus is the Messiah, the King of Israel, the only one who can save Israel and the Jewish people. Jesus revealed himself to Joseph using his Hebrew name, Yeshua. Rabbi Joseph did not abandon his Jewish heritage, but he immediately began centering every part of his Jewish faith around Yeshua of Nazareth as the Messiah of Israel. When he returned to Kishinev in Russia, he began preaching to everyone in his Jewish community that Yeshua is the Messiah, and many Jews believed and joined this new Messianic Jewish movement. By January 1885, Rabbi Joseph was hosting the first assemblies of the Israelites of the New Covenant, a community of Jews who continued practicing Judaism while also recognizing the total authority of Yeshua and placing all their hope in him. So not placing all the authority on the rabbis. This is a picture of Joseph Rabinowitz. This is the symbol of modern-day Messianic Judaism. At first, Rabbi Joseph got in trouble with both the Orthodox Jewish rabbinate and the Russian Orthodox Church, which each had some power in the systems of Russian government. The Russian religious authorities accused him of starting a new sect that was neither Jewish nor Christian. But ultimately, God was with Rabbi Joseph. In 1890, the Russian authorities gave Rabinowitz permission to open the very first Messianic synagogue in modern history. Rabinowitz taught Jews that they could maintain their culture, heritage, and language and still follow Jesus, who he always called Yeshua. Again, that's the Hebrew name for Jesus. When Rabinowitz died in 1899, the Russian leadership closed his Messianic synagogue and converted it into an Eastern Orthodox church. After this, Jews in that early Messianic movement were forced to abandon their Judaism and join the church if they wanted to keep following their Messiah. But the world remembered Rabinowitz and what he taught his Jewish community in Russia and around the world. Meanwhile, Protestant Christians around the world developed a new heart to reach the Jewish people and truly love them for Jesus. In 1915, the Hebrew Christian Alliance of America was formed to reach Jews for Jesus, and this expanded into the International Hebrew Christian Alliance by July 1928. Other Hebrew Christian congregations were established with support from Christian missionary groups, but sadly these movements brought Jews away from their Judaism and into Christian churches and a life revolving around the church. These Jews who converted to Christianity always had to isolate themselves from their fellow Jews and the ancient traditions of Judaism. Not only that, but they had their Jewish relatives reminding them of all this history that we talked about. Don't you know what these Christians have done to us? How could you join them, right? You got to see it from their perspective. In 1967, the new state of Israel miraculously won the Six-Day War against 5 Arab nations that assembled against them again. This very same year in America, the Jesus movement began, as many Christians began breaking out of their traditional religious mold and began loving the outcasts of society, particularly the hippies, many of whom were hurting Jewish Americans. Many Jews came to trust that Jesus is their Messiah in this movement that began in 1967 and continued into the 1970s. Many new Jewish believers in Jesus wanted to express their faith in Jesus through a Jewish culture. Moved by this desire in the heart of the Jewish people, a man named Martin Chernoff helped lead the establishment of the first synagogue of Messianic Judaism in America. The synagogue is called Beth Messiah, and it was founded in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1970. After this, the new Messianic Jews established Beth Yeshua in Philadelphia. Many more Messianic Jewish synagogues would follow as the Hebrew Christian Alliance became the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America. Due to their unique position of faith, Messianic Jews today are persecuted by both Orthodox Jews coming from Rabbinic Judaism and by Orthodox Christians coming from the church. Some examples of Jewish persecution: the Beth Yeshua synagogue in Philadelphia faced bomb threats, death threats, slashed tires, accusations of being a cult, and having their children spat on by their local Jewish community for outrage that they would ever put their faith in Yeshua. Gentile persecution. So John MacArthur is an outspoken opponent against Messianic Judaism. He proclaims from his pulpit that these Messianic Jews need to abandon Judaism and become Christians. Meanwhile, at another Messianic synagogue in Dallas, Texas, a neo-Nazi showed up with a machine gun planning to kill the entire congregation, but he mysteriously was unable to shoot at any of them, firing instead only into the air before the police arrived to arrest him. Despite being Jewish by blood, Jewish believers in Jesus are often forbidden from becoming citizens of Israel because of their faith. Israelis who worship in Messianic synagogues often have their property, both businesses and and synagogues vandalized. Messianic Jews in Israel are occasionally beat up or threatened by Jewish and Gentile religious extremists, requiring police protection in some cases if they're going to have an event. So we see today that the ancient Nazarenes that we talked about last week have been resurrected in the form of modern-day Messianic Judaism. Like those ancient Nazarenes, Messianic Jews today face double persecution. Today in 2023, there is a group of politicians in the Israeli government that want to pass a new law that would make preaching about Yeshua or Jesus illegal in the state of Israel. This proposed law would also violate Israeli freedom of speech. So I encourage you guys to keep Israel and all Messianic Jews in your prayers. So we've reached the end, and every Christian has to answer based on this information. Now that you're not ignorant, what do you believe about God's purposes for the Jewish people? And what does the Bible have to say about this? And that's what we're going to talk about next week.